What is this concept of democracy? To me, that innate hunger which in our country has come to the foreground and made for us this way of life, this system of equality, freedom, and social justice. We in America have built from this freedom one of the greatest nations of the earth. We started as the mere possession of an empire, and through our forefathers' courage and love of ideals, we have built until we are as great as the empire itself. That to me is what democracy, that hidden spark of freedom in man, can do. Thus, you see, democracy is man's own sense of freedom, and everyone has that spark within him. They have that spark in Germany, in Russia, and in Italy today, but it is still a spark. While in America, that spark has had the opportunity to become a flame. That to me is what democracy is. For first we must have the spark, and if we turn it into a flame, then we shall have the democratic way of life. To predict how democracy will react in a changing world, we must look to the past, for that is the only basis upon we can judge. Begin with primitive man. He had a true democracy. Every man's voice was heard when any issue was decided, but he had to sacrifice his democracy because as life became more complicated, the more backward members had to lean on their leaders, for they were not able to keep up with their fast-changing world. This led from leader and tribesman to lord and serf, from lord and serf ultimately to master and slave. Man had reached the lowest abyss in all his fight. Democracy is not merely a political concept, a social concept, or an economic concept, but rather the sum total of all our inherent drives. It is a way of life. The resultant outward manifestation of this inner spark is the flame of a democratic way of life for freedom. When the spark of freedom was so far quenched that no one could have dreamed that it even existed, yet it burned there, somewhere, for it continued in man for generation after generation. And finally, once again it burst into flame, and we had Greece, the great democracy of the ancient world, that center of learning, the beginning of man's cultural conquest of the earth. If you recall, there is an old saying that says, "Everything happens for the best." Many times it is hard to understand, but it always seems to work out eventually. The defeat of Greece was temporarily incomprehensible, but it gave way to a greater democracy, Rome. Rome, the center of all beauty. But then, dropping like a curtain before the play is done, came the Dark Ages. But it served its purpose, this blackness, this darkness, for it was rising on the stay of an even better world. Where Rome was democratic for the few, it was bringing in an era of democracy for all. Where Rome had its slaves, it was heralding the approach of a world of free men for the first time. The city that spread culture throughout the world. Yes, we could understand why Greece was to fall, for it gave way to a greater democracy. But why should Rome fall? It was the center of all democracy. But let us look at Rome. Was it truly democratic? No. Rome had its emperor. Rome had its lords. Yes, and Rome even had its slaves. Perhaps the Dark Ages were not as democratic as Rome, but they were ultimately leading to a better way of life. First came the Magna Carta, giving the almost extinguished spark a little more impetus. Cromwell and his Roundheads appeared on the scene to breathe another breath upon this spark of freedoms. Then came our own revolution, bursting that agitated spark into flame all over the English-speaking world. And once again, democracy flourished. And with the end of our Civil War, we had reached the highest peak where there was not such a thing as a slave. At last, democracy had come to banish this greatest of stones in the path of progress. For with slavery gone, the English-speaking world was truly a land of the people, by the people, for the people, with liberty and justice for all, as our great leader Lincoln had proclaimed. But progress did not stop. Serfs still existed in Europe. Men were still being tortured for their religion. People still could not think their own thoughts. And so in 1914 we fought a war to convert the spark of freedom into a glowing flame all over the world. We accomplished our purpose, but we forgot one vital thing. You can turn a spark into a flame, but you must feed the flame until it is strong, or it will die out again. Now in 1941, it seems to us that 1914 was in vain, and we can hardly believe that everything happens for the best. But men forget that the lessons learned in 1914 should be our guide in 1941. And if we use them, 1914 will not have been in vain, but rather another stepping stone in the path of progress. Yes, all through history, democracy has come and gone, but every time it has been stronger and better, giving men more and more freedom. We are now faced with another crisis, and when it is over, it is up to us to see the flame has kept burning, brighter than ever before. Yes, we are in a changing world, but after this change, the spark, which has so long been in man's bosom, can be a flame if we but remember 1914's lessons. And so I conclude with the words of the poet Briggs. Be this our covenant, unchanging, sure. Earth shall decay, the firmament shall perish. Freedom and truth immortal shall endure. This was written in 1941 when obviously World War II was commencing. And we had realized that we were going into war. Maybe it was written in 42 when war started already. And we had to realize that we had to do better this time. And I, amazingly, as a young man, realized it at that time. And I think that's why it was written that way.